Our next panel explores how the United States can safeguard its communications infrastructure. The conversation will be moderated by Liza Tobin, Managing Director at Garneau Global. Please welcome our panelists. Paul Lekas, Senior Vice President and Head of Global Public Policy at the Software and Information Industry Association. Retired Lieutenant General Kevin McLaughlin, former Deputy Commander of U.S. Cyber Command. And Chip Usher, Senior Director for Intelligence at SCSP.
Good afternoon, everybody. Since the voice of God dispensed with the introductions, I will not dwell on that. I will dive right into this exciting panel. It's great to be back here at SCSP. So, General McLaughlin, if I can start with you on this topic, you've had a tremendous wealth of experience as the former Deputy Commander at U.S. Cybercom, which has been in the news a lot lately, of course. A lot has changed since you were there. Russia has invaded Ukraine, used cyber operations against Ukraine. China has become an extremely formidable competitor. The age of AI is here. You don't have to comment on all of that, but I'm just wondering, what lessons did you take from your time at Cybercom that might be applied to defending commercial infrastructure?
Well, thank you. It's a great question. During my time there, I think we were in the early days of trying to understand specifically what could the government or the U.S. military do when it came to defending not just critical DoD infrastructure, but broader commercial infrastructure. And my lessons learned from that were we really weren't prepared. We could not articulate, whether you're on the DoD side or on the private sector side, what a strategy might be. To be candid, the DoD team didn't want to do it. We had our own assigned missions and our budgets, so there's no motivation to come forward with ideas on how to do it during that period of time. And so, as I left, I was thinking we're going to have to figure out a way to do something way different. I mean, we were discussing things which are, some of these are just crazy ideas, but things like thinking about the U.S. Coast Guard as a really interesting military entity, but also a law enforcement regulatory body. Could you create a new thing, like a cyber guard, but something that was just as comfortable showing up to see commercial customers with a role that wouldn't think the U.S. military just invaded. No different than when I'm on a lake and the Coast Guard pulls up. I don't think the military is invading. I think there's somebody there that's going to take care of me. So we were discussing models that might work, but as I left, I thought we don't really have a way to unify around a national strategy to solve national priorities to defend mostly privately held critical infrastructure. I think they've made a lot of progress in pieces of that, but we're still, the fact we're talking about it here is because we still haven't figured that out.
Yeah. Chip, before coming to SCSP, of course, you spent 32 years at the CIA, tremendous amount of experience. So I would love to call on you to talk a little bit about Salt Typhoon, which has been in the news. And for everyone not aware, this is the Advanced Persistent Threat Actor associated with the Chinese Ministry of State Security that has penetrated US telecom networks. So I just wonder if you can talk to the folks here a little bit about the vulnerabilities that have been revealed and how did we get so exposed?
Yep, okay, happy to do that. Thanks to the other panelists for being here. It's a real pleasure to talk to everybody. And just to build on what General McLaughlin just noted, one of the big changes, I think, in recent years has just been the exposure, the revelation of the extent to which the People's Republic of China is pursuing a comprehensive cyber campaign against us. Frankly, I think it's so overwhelming, it's kind of exceeded our defenses at this point. Salt Typhoon being the most recent and perhaps one of the most concerning. Senator Warner, in his remarks earlier this morning, alluded to it, but they have penetrated all of the major telecom services in the United States. We're able to listen in on conversations, text messages, and are still there because we haven't yet rooted out all of that network. But this is just the latest iteration. There have been other typhoons, right? There's Volt Typhoon, there's Flax Typhoon, where they sat on our critical infrastructure, penetrated water sewage treatment plants, pipeline companies, electric power grid. With Flax Typhoon, they also got into the Internet of Things devices. But this is a comprehensive strategy coming from Beijing that I think we need to wake up to and understand is very, very concerning, because for years they pursued data theft, IP theft, stealing our technology innovations, of course espionage, but now they're positioning to do harm, including physical harm. And that to me is quite concerning, because in the event of a crisis scenario with Beijing, they now have tools and leverage that they didn't have a few years ago. And we don't yet have the means to combat that.
Yeah, Paul, I want to bring you in because you work with a lot of private companies in your role at SIA, a lot of software and information technology companies. One thing I was struck by in my time in government in the IC and DoD was how heavily reliant the US government is on private companies, you know, Microsoft, Google, and a number of others. So I'd love to get your thoughts on who bears the responsibility for dealing with these cyber attacks like Salt Typhoon and others. You know, what is that mix between private sector and public sector responsibilities? And if there's any exciting solutions on the horizon in the private sector, I'd love to hear about that too.
Great question. Thank you, SCSP, for having me today. This is a phenomenal panel, and it's an honor to be part of it. I wish I could say there was a silver bullet solution. There's not. I think as my other two panelists, co-panelists have pointed out, that there are private sector actors and there are government actors, and they're working together to some degree. A lot of the critical infrastructure we have in the United States is private run, but you know, it's hard to say that one entity has responsibility. It's ultimately a shared responsibility, and we have to get the mix right. We have to get the institutions right, the policies, the procedures right, and we have to figure out how to advance adoption of secure by design across the value chain. Rob Joyce, who couldn't be with us today, testified yesterday before the House Select Committee on China, on the CCP, that there are still lots of flaws in software, and that's a problem. That's something we have to deal with. Now, Salt Typhoon is an interesting case because there we have the telcos building in a vulnerability to their system at the request of government, and that was done essentially to prioritize one set of policies around law enforcement over policies around security. And I think that's important to point out because we are seeing what appears to be a rise of this sort of approach by governments around the world, and to some degree in the United States as well, where competing policy priorities, in some cases they are antitrust or competition priorities. In other cases, such as in the UK right now, they are law enforcement and surveillance priorities, are resulting in or potentially resulting in a weakening of security, and especially with the advancements of sophisticated threat actors, we really need to put security at the top of the list.
Thank you for that. Please go ahead.
Just to follow up on Chip's comments about stepping back and thinking, what is really different about Salt Typhoon? He made a great point. It's not just it's really not an espionage target. It is a deterrence and a threat to destroy target. And you could say that's not equivalent to a nuclear weapon, but I just think back to the Cuban Missile Crisis. For those of you who are, I guess maybe whose parents might have been born during that period of time, but we almost went to war over not an attack, but a threat of an attack that would happen so quickly we couldn't do anything about it. And I think positioning cyber, because how quickly the attack can unfold once you have the access, is just as much of a sort of a destabilizing threat. Yet we seem to be boiling a frog where we just sort of talk about it and we kind of accept it. But someday when it does happen, we'll all be kind of accountable for just getting okay with it. And I don't think we should be.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I want to stick with the threat picture for a few more minutes before we hopefully turn to some more optimistic topics. But, you know, a number of years ago, the US government started to wake up to this threat from Huawei, but of course, the closer you look, the more you realize it's not just one Chinese company, it's not just one type of technology, and in the last few years, there's been growing awareness around vulnerabilities associated with made-in-China networking devices like routers. Rob Joyce's name was mentioned. Others have been vocal about the dangers associated with this company, this Chinese company, TP-Link, that sells these devices all over the world. I wonder, Chip, if you could just talk a little bit about that company in particular and, you know, China's growing dominance in this market of routers and related networking devices, and, you know, how could China exploit that to do us harm?
Yeah, the empty chair here is actually Rob Joyce. We're all paying homage to him. It was last summer that he awakened me to the threat posed by this company. Everybody here probably has a home Wi-Fi network. When you leave here and you go home tonight, go check what router it is. If it's a TP-Link, think about replacing it. In 2019, TP-Link had about a 10% market penetration. Now it's upwards of 60 to 70%, and they have the predominance and the Wi-Fi 7 standard, which is the latest Wi-Fi standard. Chinese company. And what's concerning is it was TP-Link routers that were part of the vulnerability that the Chinese used for Flash Typhoon, Salt Typhoon, and Volt Typhoon. So it's not just targeting national level, regional level infrastructure and systems, but now it's at the commercial level, it's at the consumer level. And so this needs action from all of us, right? I mean, we should be motivated as a population to pull this stuff out, and we should have policies in place to deal with it. And part of the issue here is the commercial advantage that China engineers for itself. I mean, they are selling TP-Link routers, as best we can estimate, at a price point below profitability levels because they enjoy government support, government subsidies. And I'm not sitting here advocating that we should do exactly the same thing for our router producers or others from allied countries, but we need to think about when China's doing this for their companies, for their systems, you know, their aim is to put their technology in the hands of all of us, and what risks come with that.
So I think it's pretty clear from our discussion that our adversaries, China, Russia, and others, don't follow the same rules that we do, and China in particular fuses government, military, intelligence, and business resources into its cyber operations and vice versa. So what can we do about this? I think I'll pose this to the entire panel, whoever wants to pick it up first. Either what meaningful steps can we start to take, or if you prefer, maybe compare and contrast China and Russia's approaches to cyber penetration. I'll defer to you first, sir, to answer if you'd like.
Well, I think just taking both parts of your question very quickly, if you think about China as China Inc., and whereas we're the United States with branches of government and sectors, and they are able to weave, whether it's a nationalized critical minerals, rare earth metals strategy to dominate in that space, microelectronics, which we've talked a lot about in this panel, to just sort of a nationalized hybrid of industries in their tech and telecommunications sectors, big data, sometimes aimed at controlling their own population, but they integrate across all of that infrastructure in order then to have these strategic impacts, either their ability to defend themselves in a strategic sense or bring all that power against, in the execution of their foreign policy against countries like the United States. I think that is an amazing power. In terms of our response to it, and somebody might ask, well, we don't want to be like China. Certainly don't want to be like, unless they're being really smart in a way that doesn't violate US values. I mean, if you look at our our standard US core values, many of them don't say that what they're doing would violate those core values, and there might be a few that are. And so the areas where I see baby steps towards this are kind of how Cyber Command's Defend Forward strategy has evolved, where they combined new authorities for them to work with the private sector, share intelligence with them, do things that they would never thought to do in other countries. And so there are ways to start moving to be smart about that, but I think those are baby steps towards a set of solutions that we need to get after that are not that.
Paul, do you want me to turn to you next?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to address that. I thought those were very powerful comments. I think we do need to improve collaboration between the public and the private sectors. And this is kind of a refrain, maybe an old refrain. I think we made some steps in that direction, but we need to be doing a lot more, especially around critical infrastructure. Though now we are realizing what some threat actors are doing and what platforms they are able to exploit to their advantage, so we need to look even more broadly. We need to have more robust information sharing, I think, without compromising our values. I mean, we don't have this civil government military fusion in the United States like you see in China, and I think that's a good thing. On the values piece, it's important to try to distinguish what those values are and why we're concerned about things like TP-Link and Huawei and so forth. Why they don't reflect the values that we think our technology should reflect. And security should be among the most important of those values, and also some degree of separation between the public and the private sector, which is why questions of encryption and providing backdoors for law enforcement purposes is such an important thing, I think, even beyond security itself, because it helps to establish the differentiator between what's happening, what we think is happening in US tech versus tech coming out of China.
And I'll just throw in, just the key word here is urgency. I think, as the general alluded to, there have been long-standing, productive, cooperative discussions and conversations, in some cases organizations and procedures built over the years between the private and the public sectors. But the urgency of the threat means that we need to move faster to actually enact solutions, and some of those solutions are going to come at a cost, right? A financial cost or slowdown in delivery of some services and that sort of thing. But those critical conversations need to happen, and they need to happen now, because we don't want to wake up in a few years where we find we cannot stand up to Chinese or Russian aggression because our systems are compromised. I'd be very interested to hear what Ann Neuberger says in the session after this, where she's been sort of leading the charge in the previous administration about having those conversations and sort of her recommendations for how they might be shaped going forward. But I think that's the key, is building on the processes that we have, but moving to action.
Chip, if I could put you on the spot a little bit because of all your regional expertise, back to my question about the difference between China and Russia, I just wonder if you could lay out a little bit how their approaches to cyber threats differ, or are they basically the same?
Well, I look at it, I see China pursuing kind of a multifaceted approach where it's grabbing data, conducting classic espionage with cyber capabilities, promoting their economy and stealing technology, stealing intellectual property, and now this kind of the new dimension that we've talked about, enabling strategic action when necessary. I think with the Russians, it's a little more smash and grab. It's a little more targeted at domestic and other enemies of the state in their eyes for espionage or direct action. They do a fair amount of support, direct and otherwise, for ransomware and criminal activity. So that's how I think of it.
Thanks, that's super helpful. So it wouldn't be an SCSP summit if we didn't talk about AI. So I think I will turn to you first, Paul, and if Chip or General McLaughlin want to weigh in, that would be great too. But AI is increasingly proffered up as a solution to companies' needs for managing network security. So Paul, I just wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about the solutions you're hearing about, and are there principles or guardrails or frameworks that help you think through how do we balance seizing these opportunities to use AI to help maintain network security without inadvertently introducing new vulnerabilities?
Yeah, so AI is definitely something that is helping security, and also it is inevitable with a technology that's powerful, creating or enabling more vulnerabilities that need to be addressed. We're seeing a great degree of uptake of AI powered tools to identify threats, to dynamically resolve threats, to do forensic analysis, and to do that at scale. So it's hard to understate how powerful these new cybersecurity tools are. I don't have a sense about the degree to which the state-of-the-art cyber tools have been adopted in a consistent way across the federal government. I think that's something that's really important to not forget about. There are some restrictions on the government's ability to kind of bring on the best-in-class tools. There are restrictions in procurement laws. There are restrictions associated with legacy systems they're working with. But definitely AI is a boon, but it is also something that is enabling threat actors to find vulnerabilities that may not have existed before. And so this is a constantly evolving area. There's a lot of work being done, for sure, in the private sector. I think we need more public-private engagement on this. I would point to NIST that has done some excellent work in the past around cybersecurity frameworks, and also on AI, especially in the past few years. And now they're bringing those together. They have a new initiative that is looking to provide guidance on how to address cyber risks that are generated by AI, and I think that's really important, and we need much more of that kind of work.
Thanks. General McLaughlin, you want to chime in?
Well, I don't think I can't predict that exactly how that's going to turn out, but what I think is possible in terms of just features of the future is that we are, and I'm not saying inappropriately, but we are being cautious to want to answer and understand many of the concerns we're just articulating, because that is what's occurring. But there's also this pace of change of AI-driven technology that is, I believe, will outstrip that careful dialogue. It doesn't mean we should just throw a bunch of autonomous weapons, into the environment, but it doesn't matter whether it's AI causing students to use it to answer test questions, or it's people using it to cheat on a remote interview, or it's using AI to defend networks, but unleashing that because we're basically having our lunch handed to us because it's being applied at such a pace. So I just think there will be a level of urgency at some point in the future to actually do something that's a little bit more aggressive than what we are, at least on the defensive side. And so, because I think the urgency of some bad threat that's actually creating havoc and damage in the country, there'll be some demand for some more quick solutions that I think we're being appropriately careful. But I think that's something we're going to have in the future, is some wake-up moment. Something's going to happen, and there will be a demand from the American people to at least be more forward-leaning in how we use AI, especially just something as simple as a pervasive use of that in defending our networks. That's a way different than AI-driven autonomous weapons in the battle space. And so I think you may see categories of tasks where there'll be some demand for a little bit more aggressive use of the technology.
It's tantalizing. I wonder if you can add any more specificity on that, something more offensive, proactive, I know that you mentioned earlier your experience leading these defend forward operations at Cybercom. Maybe you could shed a little more light on what those were, and if you can add any more specificity to what you are anticipating or calling for in the future.
Well, first of all, we were doing the academic underpinnings of that. I left before we actually started doing those operations, but I taught about it and thought a lot about it. And it's not necessarily an AI-related answer. What I think has been interesting about it is that we made, first of all, a policy decision and an authorities decision in the country to say these below the level of armed conflict attacks against the country, messing with our democratic core processes, stealing IP, each one of those by itself wasn't an act of war. But when they happened in a cumulative sense over a long period of time, they were deemed by the national policymakers as a strategic threat to the country. In other words, those types of threats we do something about. And that's when then General Nakasone was given the authority to start operating against our adversaries below the level of armed conflict. And they haven't said everything they're doing, but they've been open. That it includes offensive actions against our adversaries, but it also includes teams forward in other countries, pulling out malware from those countries and then posting it around the world and just sort of immediately letting people inoculate against a set of malware that we would study, maybe for months, maybe never even show the public. And then also sharing great intel, but in a way to facilitate action by the interagency, but now even to commercial sectors. I mean, so there are three major sets of changes of how Cyber Command and NSA are working, not just by themselves, but with this broader ecosystem, but with authority to do it. And now it's an assigned mission versus something that's a distraction from an assigned mission. So those are just a few of the features, I think. And I think that's continued on and matured. If you just read General Hawk, read his posture statement at his last Armed Services Committee, and he's very eloquent about a lot of those actions in an unclassified forum. So it's worth looking at because it's informative to the topic that we're on right now.
Thanks. Chip, I want to make sure I don't skip you if you wanted to add anything more on the AI
No,
question.
just very briefly, I think AI just adds a speed factor to all of this that will sort of be mind-boggling, and it will put stress on the human in the loop, human on the loop paradigm that we're all sort of used to, because our adversaries in the not too distant will be employing AI at scale for their purposes, and we'll have the opportunity and the peril of AI versus AI in the cyber realm, and what procedures, what scenarios are we going to enable automatic responses, because you will have nanoseconds for some of this. And that's going to stress our policy approaches and, frankly, our systems. Thanks.
So we have just a few more minutes before I go to our final lightning round. So I'll ask you a question I didn't give you a chance to prepare for. A highly technical one too, so completely unfair of me as a moderator, but open source software and hardware, this is a hot topic. It's now increasingly used, including in critical infrastructure. I, for one, just have not really come across policy approaches to this. How should policymakers think about this? Are there approaches or frameworks to help think about the security vulnerabilities that might be introduced if you agree that security vulnerabilities are introduced through open source? Does anyone want to take that one on?
I mean, there are some companies that I think are using that approach way to their advantage, but then they have a model, sort of this vertically integrated model of sort of continually monitoring in big complex networks, pushing network updates maybe more than once a day. Versus in my world, in DoD, it's like, okay, it's going to update, we're going to do updates once a month or something. And so I think there's a way to leverage that for scale and speed, but perhaps a way of operating and running an ecosystem if you care about security, whether it's because of your service agreements or just the security of whatever it is you're operating. And I think there's a way to sort of balance both of those to where it's useful. But if you don't have that piece and you're really not sure about the genesis of your software and your hardware and that in the world you're talking about, but without those features, I don't think you have any idea what you're injecting into the risk in your system. So I think it depends on how maybe it's being used.
Anything to add or move on? So the lightning round, I just want to give each of you a chance to talk about what risks or threats are you most worried about, and then what tech developments or advancements are you most excited about in terms of keeping us safe from cyber vulnerabilities in our network. So Paul, can I start with you?
Sure. Great question. So I think I'm concerned about the impact of AI on cyber risk side. I think Chip put it really well. Things are going to move so fast, and this has already begun. There are threat actors who are already using AI to break into networks, and so I think that's a real concern. I think technology is going to get better and faster even before we crack the quantum code. And we need to make sure that we are investing as much or more on the security side to make sure that we can keep up with things. I think in terms of a positive technology, I would say the suite of what we call, probably it's a misnomer, privacy-enhancing technologies, different forms of advanced encryption and so forth that can add layers of protection even when data is being used. I think that is something that I've found exciting for years, and I think once we figure out how to incorporate that into more platforms, it will help to increase the level of security we have. One last point, if I may. I am always concerned about the lack of talent that we have, of people who can actually shepherd what we need to do, and I think especially in government. And it's a time of uncertainty right now, and I think it's just really important to focus on making sure that we can, fully resource the government in these core national security areas to work collaboratively with the private sector and try to increase the level of cyber protection that we have in the United States.
Thank you.
I'll be super quick. AI. I think what worries me, though I know people are working on it, is we need to develop a concept and a program for creating defense in depth for our future national security AIs. That's an urgent task before us. I think AI offers great promise to help us in this realm because it's going to unlock new capabilities. I'm thinking here particularly of agentic AI and how that can be deployed at scale to help defend our systems.
You have the last word.
I think the part that I worry most about is, as important as this is, we could maybe pick ourselves up and move to a conference room in another part of town, and they're talking about a different emergency, critical minerals and rare earth metals, which Chip and I have done some work on. Over here, we're talking about microelectronics. And what I worry about is it's not clear which emergencies really going to galvanize action in the country. And I think the action that's needed is I think we make a lot of incremental improvements in these areas, but they don't get after the problem. Like you think about Operation Warp Speed, there was a clear emergency, but you had a market, sort of a government created a market, industry came up with the solutions, they had commercial incentives, they got rid of a lot of the regulatory. So there was all these strategic pieces in place that generated this major outcome. And so I think my largest worry is that we will nibble on the edges of this. The thing that I'm most excited about is it's entities like SCSP and the industry represented in the room. I think that is the power of our country. And if there is a way that government could do the things that it could do best in this world to empower and unleash that, that's what I would be most excited about. I think that's our advantage, and I think that's how we win at the end of the day.
On that note, we are out of time. So Paul, Chip, and General McLaughlin, thank you so much. And please join us in thanking our outstanding panelists.